I think when people compare the late Roman Republic to the United States, they do it badly. Because they're grabbing on to similarities, and people like to do that whenever they say history repeats itself or history rhymes. They like to just focus on these details, the details of things, and latch onto them and repeat them. And I could make historical similarities and say history repeats itself with almost anything. I can't think of any examples at the top of my head right now, but when people compare, they say corruption was in Rome, and there's corruption now in America, and there's polarization, populism, and the politicians, they have these strong figureheads, these politicians. Well, those are features of every empire, of every civilization, are they not? Is every civilization Rome? What makes Rome, particularly the Roman Republic, the late Roman Republic, so much like America, so much like the United States today? What is it? Because America doesn't have a Caesarian-like figure. It has a Senate, but its Congress isn't that of Rome's. It isn't that of the Roman Republics. And there's no crossing of the Rubicon. And there's so much more that we can look at when we're comparing the Roman Republic to the United States. And if you already know Rome, you kind of know that the late Republic it's not the story of the ambitious man, Julius Caesar, coming in and wrecking this healthy system. You know that Caesar is preceded by figures like Sulla. And Caesar is really the climax of Rome. He's the climax of Rome, not necessarily the beginning. And the system had been under strain for so long before Julius Caesar arrived on the scene, even in his lifetime. When he was 18, hiding because of the prescriptions under Sulla, that was 100 years before the Republic fell. Everything was falling apart in Rome before he even got on the scene. And the structural crisis of Rome is what we need to look at in America. Because by the late Republic, the signs of instability, by the time Caesar had crossed the Rubicon, by the time he did it, he was exploiting a republic that had been damaged by its own empire, by inequality and the factional hatred, the private ambition of individuals, and the violation of constitutional order, basically. It's these things. It's the system around the Roman Republic that is so similar and so fascinating when comparing America to Rome. Not necessarily the corruption itself, not the fact that America's laws are based on Rome or whatever. It's the system in which the late Roman Republic is in. The preceding events to Caesar in the late Roman Republic is what America's like. And if we're going to compare Rome and America, that's where we need to begin, with the institutions that are there when people like Caesar arrive. We can't focus on the personalities, we can't compare Donald Trump to Caesar, and that's not the right way to look at this. We need to ask about the institutions and how they govern a society that is changing so quickly. And it's changing faster than the institutions can handle. The institutions, that was foundationally, I think, what may have gone wrong, possibly, with the late Roman Republic. The institutions could not keep up with the change that was being demanded of the people and that was being demanded of the nature of Rome. And the Roman Republic, if we go back to the Middle Republic, it had been a city-state that was of the elite. It was a city-state elite governing a wider alliance system. It was very aristocratic, it was very competitive, very status-driven. And it was never democratic at all. Rome was never democratic in any regard, I would certainly say, at least. I think most people agree with me there, at least. Their Roman senators were not senators in the way we think of them. They were not public servants. They were They were like the nobles. They were competitors. They were champions in a prestige system, a ranking system of sorts. And politics wasn't about public debate. It was about the rivalry between these men. The offices, the military glory, the public honor, the legal influence, patronage, marriage alliances, these sort of things were still all very political at the time, and they all ran together. And you see some of that in America now, but it's different. It is different. Because politics now, it feels like everyone has an opinion on politics. It's no longer this aristocratic thing. And since the 2010s, really, I feel like, even the roots of it have gone back farther in our nation's history, but populism is much more of a, prevalent feature of America than it was Rome. And the system in Rome held because there were expectations and habits and limits of this aristocratic class. The aristocracy fought, but they're all fighting within a shared understanding of what counted as legitimate competition. They had an understanding. They had mutual agreements. They had ground rules to their fighting, basically. And what went wrong is that Rome won too much. Rome expanded too much. If you look at a map of Rome, just look at the map of Rome, the Roman Republic. It got big. It got really big. Rome's expansion made the Republic so much richer, just materially, resource-wise. It made it, more powerful, and at the same time unstable. This can be assumed, right? Most people can imagine that expansion of a great empire is going to make it more unstable. And the victory abroad changed the distribution of wealth at home. And you had all these resources pouring into Rome, the treasure, just the land, slaves, and opportunities were pouring into Rome. And provincial commands got bigger. Military glory became larger with these resources, more of them. Individual reputations became larger. Like people like Caesar, think of that later on. The stakes grew immensely. A senator was no longer, trying to be prominent in a city. He was competing for wealth of empires, for armies in the field, for a scale of personal influence for him that the older Republican habits of Rome were not really designed to absorb. And that matters for the American comparison, because one of the reoccurring problems I see, at least in republics, is that institutions built for one scale of power and social life do not automatically adapt when the society becomes vastly richer, larger, more unequal, and more interconnected. Think globalism, maybe, with America. And Rome's institutions were conservative in the literal sense. Not conservative as we think of it now, but literally conservative. They preserved old forms even as the reality underneath them changed. Like even as the literal reality of their empire changed, the forms, the social forms and institutions remained. And America has its own version of that problem. You have 18th century constitutional machinery, which is our Constitution, governing a continental superstate with global military reach, mass media, digital propaganda, massive concentrations of wealth, and administrative capacities that the founders certainly could have not imagined. People throw that word around. They say the founders couldn't have imagined this. The founders could not have imagined. I don't think that means the Constitution is meaningless. I just think that the new form that we're living in, the new system we live in, is under extreme pressure. I'm not saying I'm a critic of the Constitution. I'm just saying the forms that we are under right now, the systems we are under right now, our early system isn't made for that. Now, if we go back to Rome, I think the earliest sign of underlying tension was the agrarian and the manpower issue. And that kind of changed after 100 BC. You know, the traditional Roman story of like the small citizen farmer had long been tied to military service and civic identity. The ideal Roman citizen was a land-holding man who fought for the Republic and then returned to his fields. I forget the dictator who did that. But, the picture was stylized, obviously. It was kind of a fantasy. But it mattered as an ideal, just like the American dream mattered. Over time in Rome, prolonged military service and the accumulation of land, especially in like Middle Roman Republic, kind of weakened that class, and the wealthier Romans consolidated property into larger estates that were manned increasingly by slave labor. And I wouldn't say that made the countryside like absent of individuals overnight, but it meant that the base of the citizenry of Rome, the social base of the old citizen body, was changing dramatically. And if you've heard of the Gracchi brothers, those are really interesting because they're like, I don't know how to compare them because I don't want to, make a wrong comparison. But the political system of the Roman Republic visibly shook with the Gracchi brothers. Tiberius Gracchus was not like a revolutionary outsider, though. He was an aristocrat. He was very connected. He was operating within Roman politics. But his land reform proposal and the methods, the reactions around it, exposed how brittle the Roman Republican system had become at that time. And it showed that the issue was never itself about just land. It was about the ruling elite and how the ruling elite could still address the structural problems through ordinary politics that so many people had become disaffected with. Tiberius bypassed the senatorial resistance by appealing to the popular assembly, and his opponents responded with violence, basically. He and many of his supporters were clubbed to death, if I recall correctly. So you can kind of see the tension there already with the opposition to the elite there. Maybe that's ringing some bells with America. And that itself is one of the moments that people like to identify as the beginning of the end for America, as the beginning of the end for Rome. Sorry, and there is some truth in that. Not necessarily because Rome had never seen political conflict before. The focus isn't necessarily the political conflict, but because this was it was an elite political murder in the center of the Republic. And it was justified as a defense of the state itself, the Roman state. And once violence in Rome became an acceptable tool of internal politics, something changed. I wouldn't say instantly, not irreversibly in that afternoon, but a repertoire of political action widens. The possibility expands, the imaginable expands. And that is always really dangerous in a republic because republics aren't necessarily built for that. And then you have Gaius Gracchus, more, expansive, more, I would say, sophisticated politically. And again, the deeper issue appears again out of the ground. Not the reform itself, but whether the existing class could absorb reform without treating it as this existential threat to themselves. Rome could still produce talent. It could still produce legislation, and it could still produce legal forms. What it could not produce at this time, and increasingly so, was trust among its rulers. And that is one of the strongest points. Just saying that makes me laugh because it's like, does that not remind you of America? Does that not remind you of the United States? The real danger in a republic, it's never going to be disagreement. Rome was full of disagreement. America is full of disagreement. Every country is full of disagreement. That's politics. And politics isn't dangerous on its own. It quickly can become dangerous, but disagreement isn't at the heart of what's dangerous about politics. The danger itself is when major factions no longer believe their opponents can govern legitimately, can win legitimately or reform legitimately, or even remain within the same political system or political order. And politics, once it becomes like this battle over whether the other side is inherently unlawful or treasonous, regime destroying, or civilizationally intolerable, then every norm becomes negotiable. Every pre-established norm or tradition or habit of politics, if that's a good way to put it, becomes negotiable. There's wiggle room there, and that's dangerous. And at that point, people stop asking the question, what is lawful, or what's the customary thing to do, or what's the legal thing to do, maybe in America. And they stop asking those questions, and they start asking the question, what is necessary to stop them? What is necessary to stop our enemies? Let's go back to Rome here. Rome gets to this point, I think, gradually. And the Gracchi brothers, it's not, that itself isn't full collapse. It's a big step there. And it's a sign that they're getting to the collapse, that the Roman Republic is getting to that collapse. It's more like the opening of a new stage, of a new, era, where force, like this procedural hardball and extra-constitutional maneuver, begins to appear a lot more often in Rome. And then you get Marius, who just throw the military into this equation, and it's a whole nother area where, when in comparison to America, I think it needs to be handled very carefully. Rome's military system changed in a way I think America's hasn't. And that difference matters a lot because the military in any country, in any civilization, matters a lot. It's overlooked a lot, especially when politics becomes the key point, but the military is extremely important. And I think America's military has not changed in the way that Rome's did. But the Roman case that doesn't mean the Roman case can't tell us something about what happens when state institutions lose their exclusive command over loyalty. And so look at Marius in the Marian reforms. The kind of textbook version of him makes him too singular because he's only associated with the Marian reforms. But the larger point still remains, and it's that armies became more professionalized and more dependent on commanders for reward, for payment, land, and promotion, advancement. And so soldiers, obviously, would increasingly look towards their generals, not to the abstract idea of the Republic, not to the Roman Republic. They looked for their futures. They looked out for themselves. And once that becomes normal for the soldiers, it's a short road to turning the army into like a personal political force, literally a secret police, maybe. Same thing could be said about, maybe the police. Maybe the police in America have a closer, similarity with the military in Rome, but I still think there's too many differences there. And I just think America's military is on the stage where it's being overlooked as this kind of revolutionary force. I don't know if that's the right word to use, as this potentially revolutionary force. But I would still say America is not there, and it is important not to, flatten this comparison into nonsense. The United States military it's not a cluster of, personal armies under each general or each branch waiting for like a charismatic general or governor or senator or congressman to march on Washington and take the capital. That's not the situation America is in right now. The Roman Republic had no modern bureaucratic state. People forget that when we talk about it because it's so much like our system, but they had no bureaucracy like we did. They had a bureaucracy, but there was no modern military professionalism in the same sense as it is now. There's no equivalent of a politically neutral command structure embedded in a constitutional culture of, subordination to our civilian institutions. So the direct military parallel, it doesn't work. It breaks down. But the broader principle, 100%, remains worth noting. Republics, the thesis of this little part here is that republics become or get into serious danger when individuals or networks or factions can command forms of loyalty more intense than loyalty to institutions. Mainly, this is for the military in this case. In Rome, that was obviously the armies. In modern states, that's the military, but people haven't recognized that. Right now, we're able to recognize it in party identity or ideological media ecosystems or echo chambers, if you want to call it that, oligarchic funding networks, and just mass, you can see this with certain people, mass personal devotion to leaders. The mechanism differs, but the structural issue, the structural question is undoubtedly very similar. And when people become attached to a man or a movement or a tribe more than to a constitutional order, that is when the institutional restraints start to weaken. And as we get into the next century with Sulla, he's a massive turning point because he's doing something shocking and precedent-setting that, I think sets Rome down the inevitable path to collapse, the Roman Republic at least. He marches on Rome. And that is one of the acts whose full significance can be missed because we know what comes later. We're in the present, we look at history, we know the answers to history. But it's something so significant that I don't think if you were alive in Rome at the time, you would have no idea what would come next. Obviously, we have the answers to history now. That's one of the things you always have to remember when looking at historical events. To us, it seems obvious what will happen. But to the people in Rome, when Sulla marched on Rome, it's crazy. It's new. We obviously know about Caesar at our point in time, so Sulla can feel, like a rehearsal for Caesar. But imagine being a Roman aristocrat, having been formed and molded by the old Republican assumptions, and you're watching a consul settle his political disputes by bringing an army into Rome. That is not just another conflict. That is literal. That's insanity for you. If you're seeing that, that's insanity. And that's proof there that the old taboos can be broken. And once they're broken, it can't be unbroken. You can't fix that. I don't think so. Unless it's over a very long period of time, it can't be unbroken. And so that is that's one of the most important things to understand about Republican decline. It's that the institutions are not just the laws and the offices. They are accumulations of restraint. They are all restraining themselves. Much of political order depends on what powerful people decide not to do. Everything in our government and all Republican governments rest upon the trust that everyone is going to do the right thing. Once a major actor in this system demonstrates that an old limit, one of these limits, was never physically impossible, merely, culturally forbidden, Other actors in the scene, other forces, other institutions learn from it. Other individuals learn from it. They're obviously going to maybe condemn it publicly, but they're going to absorb it privately. They're going to learn from this privately. The political imagination of these people changes. And Sulla showed that the armed seizure of the city was possible. He showed that prescriptions were possible. He showed that saving the Republic could be used to justify extraordinary concentration of power in Rome. And it worked, for him at least. I mean, he lived through it all. And notice how the Roman political actors loved that language. Everyone loved the language of defending the Republic. Everyone was defending the Republic. Everyone was, preserving order. Everyone was restoring order. Everyone was preserving liberty. And this is not because they were all, cynical in like this cartoonish sense. It's because most political actors, especially the ambitious ones, interpret their own power as necessary. They do not say, I am destroying norms for personal advancement. They say the emergency is so grave that only unusual measures can preserve the Commonwealth, can preserve the Republic, can preserve the nation. That is very familiar. It is very familiar in every age, really, but especially in ours. I mean, the language. Do you see the similarities? I don't know. I do. I think it's interesting. And with Sulla's dictatorship, you get both a reaction and an innovation. There is a conservative restoration carried out by revolutionary means. He used extraordinary force to strengthen senatorial authority and constrain the popular tribunes. There's a real lesson there because it shows that the institutional language can conceal institutional damage. You can claim to be restoring the Republic. You can claim to be restoring the Constitution while teaching everyone that constitutions are subordinate to force, which is what Sulla did. You can speak in the name of legality while normalizing the idea that legality survives by exception. And this is a modern pattern that republics, especially modern republics, should never feel too smug about. And after Sulla, obviously the Republic doesn't end. That's important. The system survived. Rome survived Sulla. It lasted through Sulla. Systems can survive repeated shocks for a surprisingly long time. I mean, systems are built to, survive, to last through things. And Rome survived through Sulla, which is surprising. If I was around then, I don't know if I would think Rome would survive. I think I'm more of a Panician in that sense. I'd be the Roman panicker. But the fact that Rome survived, and the fact that systems can survive, repeated shocks over, a surprisingly long time, makes observers complacent sometimes. Rome continued to function. The offices continued, elections continued, courts continued, the speeches continued, the Senate still met, political life was still Republican on the surface at least, but the content of it all was changing. Continually, you can kind of see that power began to lie in more informal combinations, in like military commands, wealth, sort of intimidation, whether between important figures or even down to the individual, and like intimidating the individual with the power of the state and people's personalities, these informal things. So the shell survives longer than the habits that made the shell meaningful. That's the takeaway from this. The shell of the Roman Republic lasted longer than what actually made the Roman Republic, especially after Sulla. But people were blind to that. That's what made people, maybe shocked people about Caesar, about Julius Caesar when he came. And this, again, is where the comparison to, America becomes useful. One of the laziest ways to think about political decline is to imagine that it has to look like a formal abolition, that there will be one set thing that we can mark as the end. But republics can deteriorate while retaining all of their, pizzazz, all their familiar words. You can still have constitutions, courts, elections, and legislatures, but the public trust will still drain away. And all the norms can be, gamed to the edge. The executive discretion expands, and political life becomes a contest in which every side assumes the other will use every weapon available, kind of like Sulla did. The form remains, but the confidence in it decays. The confidence and the trust decays. And that's where you kind of see what I'm talking about with America. I mean, do you see it in America? I certainly do. And Pompey is also a great example of how the Republican crisis produces men who are just larger than life, literally larger than life. They are too large for ordinary politics. That is Pompey. He is not just successful, he is large. He is oversized. His commands are oversized. His prestige is oversized. His career is oversized. It's massive. It's structured by just the exceptionalism of it all. And Rome continues to reward exception because exception means efficient. The Roman system kept finding reasons to elevate singular men above ordinary procedure because the empire needs results. Things need to get done. Pirates need crushing. Eastern campaigns need settling. Grain supplies need to be secured. Trade routes need to be secured. Crises need resolving. And great men like Pompey rise well in those scenarios. Pompey he's not a populist. He's not a popular figure. He gets things done well. And that's the other risky part of this whole system. People who get things done really well and are rewarded by it are especially dangerous. But we don't recognize them now in America. Every time you solve a constitutional problem by relying on an extraordinary individual, you're weakening the habits of the ordinary government. And that's what Pompey was doing with Rome. And this is what I would say one of the more uncomfortable parallels to American political culture. I would say Americans, maybe more than they realize, are very susceptible to the politics of personal rescue. Not in the obvious, populist sense, or I should say not only in the obvious populist sense, but more broadly. The idea that these institutions are too slow, too corrupt, too compromised, too procedural, and that the system is rotten, there's a swamp, and therefore what is needed is a uniquely forceful figure who will get things done. Sometimes that figure is imagined as, a tribune of the people. Sometimes he's like a tough executive, sometimes an outsider businessman maybe. And this isn't about just one person. I know you're probably thinking Trump, but this will apply to more people and has already applied to previous people. Sometimes this person will be perceived as a savior, a reformer, a national unifier. The ideological costume with whoever it is, it's gonna change. But the appetite for concentrated corrective agency, it doesn't change. And Rome keeps generating these figures because its political class cannot solve the underlying problems collectively. It can only temporarily, at least, stabilize them through exceptional careers. And you probably think of a few Roman names when it comes to that. And then what comes after Sulla is when we get into Caesar and Pompey, the first triumvirate, which it's not a formal political office in itself or any sort of office in itself, but what it is this informal understanding among Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus that they're aligned. It's an alliance, basically. This very informal alliance. And this matters because it shows the growing gap between the constitutional appearance of Rome and the actual powers of Rome. On paper, the Republican offices remain central. In practice, however, it's the elite bargaining among a few dominant men, like the First Triumvirate, that increasingly are deciding the outcomes of Rome. Patronage, obligation, intimidation, and prestige, maybe military prestige, are all distorting the constitutional field of Rome, in a way. And again, this does not necessarily it doesn't have to map directly onto America, but the resemblance at the level of function is there. I can argue that it is there. And when political systems formally remain democratic or formally remain republican, whatever it is, while the real influence is increasingly being concentrated among, let's say, for example, in America, donor networks, party machines, media blocks, administrative elites, and a small class of people who can shape the field before ordinary citizens ever enter it. There is a similar disjunction between the nominal structure and operative reality. Citizens still vote, just as Romans still voted, but the range of possible outcomes narrows. It is heavily structured by the forces above and around the formal constitutional mechanism. The ability of the citizens remains, but the outcomes narrow. Now, Caesar. Since I'm going to the school book image of Caesar as either a hero or a villain, I'm going to put that aside. But his role as the man who most perfectly exploited every weakness the Republic accumulated, that is how I'm going to look at him. I'm going to tell you this now, and I truly believe this. Caesar was brilliant. He was ambitious. He was ruthless. He was charming. He was patient. And when necessary, he was reckless. When necessary. And he was extremely good at converting his military success into political success and political inevitability. He was not outside the system in any regard. Don't get that mistaken. He was not an outsider. He was the system. He was the system at its fullest stress. And the confrontation with Pompey and the senatorial bloc, it's not just a battle between, democracy and oligarchy or, reform and reaction. It is a struggle inside a political order that no longer has a trusted method for containing the first rank competition. Caesar cannot safely become a private citizen. His enemies cannot safely let him remain armed and powerful. Everyone fears prosecution, humiliation, marginalization, elimination if they lose. And so once politics reaches that level, compromise, it becomes rational from the standpoint of these Caesarian-like figures, from the standpoint of, these ambitious actors. So this is one of the more sobering lessons from the late Republic. Systems become unstable when defeat becomes intolerable. If, losing office means maybe you can come back in a few years, then the system can breathe. If losing means ruin, prosecution, social destruction, total, ideological exclusion, or maybe arguably even worse, permanent subordination, then people are going to take greater risks to avoid losing. People like Caesar. Rome's elite political world had become more and more like that. High office had become not necessarily less of an honor, but it was more about the protection, the leverage, the wealth, the prestige. It was a shield against your enemies. That is what high office had become in Rome. And America, I think, has avoided a bit of this, but it still has elements of this dynamic. Not to the same degree, not in the same form, but enough to matter. Enough that you should recognize it. As, political life becomes more nationalized, more moralized, if that's even a word, more, career totalizing and more media saturated, defeat like this does become less of an ordinary setback and more like this sort of existential dispossession. Parties now are not merely alternating in office. This isn't like the early 2000s or the 90s or the 80s or whatever. Parties aren't just coming back and forth and, getting along. They're increasingly imagining themselves as either saving the country or handing it to the destroyers. Both parties in America, Democrat and Republican. And that mentality is continuously, I've recognized it as an individual on the TV. It's raising the stakes of every political contest, every election. It makes the procedural restraint harder. It incentivizes preemptive escalation, is what it's doing. And that is extremely dangerous. Rome is showing us what happens when elite competition is being conducted under, existential assumptions for too long, basically. And when Caesar crosses the Rubicon in, 49 BC, the phrase, Caesar crosses the Rubicon, that was revolutionary. It started a civil war. But the phrase gets overused so much, crossing the Rubicon, and people stop hearing how serious it was. They literally, they don't understand how serious it was. It was not a metaphor then. Crossing the Rubicon was not a metaphor. It was the military violation of the set political boundary that separated the provincial command from the civic core of the Roman Republic. But again, the important part is not that Caesar started, acting in outside of the legal norm. The point is that by then, the Republic had already trained its leading men to think in these exceptional terms. Caesar's act was extraordinary, but it arose in this political culture where these extraordinary remedies had increasingly become a part of elite strategy, of the best strategy, of the strategy of the greats of Rome. And then obviously, after Caesar crosses the Rubicon, civil war, dictatorship, reform, all this stuff, the concentration of honors, the symbolic drift towards monarchy, all this stuff that Caesar does. That's a story for another time, Caesar himself, what he does. But it all, in the end, culminates in his assassination on the Ides of March. And the assassins are doing this because they imagine themselves as restorers. And this is one of history's most recurring delusions. The belief that removing one central figure can reverse the social and institutional transformations that made that figure possible. Everything has been set in motion at this point by the time Caesar is killed. Brutus and Cassius, they can kill Caesar, but they cannot recreate the old republic because at this point the old republic was already gone in substance. Too many things had changed. Too many incentives had changed. Too many precedents had been thrown out the window. Too much faith had been lost. And too many great men, had learned to operate in a new style that was increasingly working, and certainly worked for Caesar until he was stabbed 23 times. And this is worth stressing because when people talk about saving republics or saving democracies or whatever, they think really personally. And I've noticed this very recently, the past just 3 years. They want the bad man gone. They want the right election. They want the right court ruling, the right law, the right, coalition to win. They want the right scandal to break. And those things can matter, but when a republic is in deeper trouble, the issue is not one person. It is whether the habits of restraint, legitimacy, mutual toleration can still exist strongly and strong enough so that both leaders and the public make constitutional life believable. Rome after Caesar still had Republican names, Republican offices, Republican nostalgia, Republican rhetoric, but what it lacked was a ruling class capable of subordinating itself to Republican limits. Everything was maybe Republican in name, but not Republican in action. And that's how Octavian wins. That's why Octavian wins. Not just because he is shrewd, which he is. I could get into him and Mark Antony. And Mark Antony is, he's beatable. That is of his own fault. But Octavian wins because he understands something essential. He understands the situation. He's young, but he is very smart. He understands that Romans are exhausted. He understands that for literally the past 100 years at this point, Rome has been in chaos. There's just been civil conflict, proscriptions, betrayals, emergency powers, all this competition among the elite with no closure ever. Then what happens is, to the people, order becomes a lot more attractive than liberty, in the older Republican sense of liberty. Maybe that's too simple, though. It might be better to say that order is becoming the condition under which people are willing to accept a reduction in competitive freedom among the elites. Octavian, or I'll call him Augustus now, Augustus Caesar, first emperor of Rome, if you don't know what I'm talking about, he does not abolish Roman political language. I find that very interesting. When I was first studying Rome, I was always asking myself, how did the Roman Republic become the Roman Empire? It seems they use all the same political language for their offices, the titles, and such. Augustus kept that. Instead of abolishing the language of the Republic, he domesticates it. He preserves the appearance of this Republican continuity while reorganizing the actual power around himself, making himself emperor. I mean, legally, I don't know if he was ever considered an emperor. He still legally was the leader of the Roman Republic. I find that very interesting, that all the Republican stuff stayed, even as Rome became an empire. And this should sound familiar, at least in a broad theoretical sense, because constitutions, I think, rarely actually die. They rarely die by announcing that they're dead. They're absorbed, they're redirected, they're, maybe repackaged. Rome didn't, wake up one day and say, this day we were a republic, today we are an empire. The forms blurred. The legal shell of Rome adapted. The legal shell of the republic adapted. The new order legitimized itself through continuity. And that's often how, durable political change works. Now, how does this, connect to America without being some alarmist or something? Rome and America are both republics that have acquired immense scale and power beyond anything the original founders could have imagined, beyond the horizon of their founding structures, let's say that, because we don't exactly know who founded Rome. Rome was not designed in any simple sense to govern this massive Mediterranean empire. America's founding framework was not conceived for a digital age superpower with global military commitments, corporate concentrations on a earthly planetary scale, mass administrative governance, and round-the-clock ideological mobilization through technology. In both cases, the inherited institutions are asked to process these realities, which are much larger than those that form them. Much, much larger. And it's especially interesting for America because it's been such a short time. It's been just, 250 years? And so much has changed already. The second point is that both societies, both America and Rome, exhibit the destabilizing political effects of inequality. And I don't mean that inequality alone can cause collapse. I don't think it does. I think that's too crude. Rome was long unequal before the late Republic. America has been unequal in many periods of time. I mean, just take a history class in high school. It's been unequal all of its history. What matters is the political interpretation of equality. In Rome, wealth, concentration amplified the competition of the elite, and it weakened the social basis of the older civic ideals. In America, enormous concentrations of wealth distort representation. They're kind of intensifying the cynicism. I notice this especially among the younger people. They separate the ruling class from the ordinary citizens. And in America, they feed the belief that, formal equality is masking the substantive oligarchy. And once that belief spreads widely enough, people start looking for anti-system remedies. My third point is that both the Roman and American systems show the strain that comes when politics becomes like a show, when it becomes a theater of this moral annihilation rather than adversarial coexistence. Like the Civil War might be a good example of this. The two parties, Republican and Democrat, became one of moral annihilation. But after the Civil War, they came back into adversarial coexistence. Roman factions were not, modern political parties, but they did increasingly behave like camps that were, convinced the other side's victory threatened the state itself. The result was not merely, harsh rhetoric to, combat this or make this a big deal. It was the willingness to bend procedure and deploy force and justify extraordinary action to defeat the other side. America is obviously different in, form and degree. I've said this repeatedly. But the same pattern is visible when your rivals, the other party, is treated not as, dangerous fellow citizens even, but as inherently illegal usurpers, traitors, or enemies beyond toleration. A republic can survive really deep disagreement. It can. Governments can survive that. Democracies can survive that. It cannot easily survive the widespread conviction that normal constitutional turnover is intolerable. It cannot survive that. My fourth point is that both of these societies reward charismatic mediation over institutional trust. You had in Rome the Senate becoming less capable of commanding broad confidence in Rome. You had strong figures who could appeal above it or around it. In America, what's the approval rating of Congress? Terrible. I haven't checked it, but I know it's terrible. In America, as you know, the trust in Congress, our media, bureaucracy, our universities, our courts, and even our elections, it's eroded. Politics at that point becomes more of a personal thing, more driven by spectacle and identification. People stop believing in the system, so they begin believing in a person, or they believe in a movement embodied in a person. That is never a stable foundation for Republican life. Republican life is opposed to that completely. My fifth point is that both republics are revealing how the procedural forms can remain intact while the substantive norms decay. I think this is the big one. This is the biggest one. Rome did not lose republicanism at all. If you have not researched Rome, I'm begging you to. Research the end of the Roman Republic. And maybe the similarities will call out to you too. Maybe you'll have some better insight if you care to share. But Rome did not lose its republicanism all at once. It lost the willingness of elites to be bound by republican restraint. In America's central danger, if one wants to speak carefully, it's not some immediate imperial coronation scene. It's not the sudden establishment of a dictatorship. Rather, it is the slow wearing out of our constitutional culture, treating every loophole as a weapon to attack the enemy with, every ambiguity, oh my God, as exploitable, every tradition as this optional rule to follow, every institution as this merely as an instrument, every opponent, every time they win, becomes presumptively suspect. Once that becomes routine, the written framework is no longer enough to preserve the Republican ideal. Now, I should say where the comparison stops, because there are differences between Rome and America. There are, serious analogies actually depend on limits. There's a gray zone with everything. America is not like Rome in the literal sense. The social structure is different. The economy is different. The military is different. The laws are different. The legal order is different. The religious world is different. The scale of the citizenry is different. And our administrative state is incomparably more developed. Rome's politics were aristocratic and openly. They were aristocratic. That was no secret. They were status hierarchical in a way modern democratic politics is not. Even when, oligarchic tendencies are strong in democracies. Rome had no entrenched norm of universal citizenship in the modern sense. When we talk about Roman citizens, it's completely different from the way we talk about citizenship today. Rome had no mass electoral parties, no modern communications, no impersonal bureaucracy that could, carry on governments independently of the elite households. So nobody should pretend like America and Rome are the exact same. But that's not the point of historical comparison anyway. The point is not prediction by whatever costume it's wearing. The point is pattern recognition. The late Roman Republic shows what happens when this grand expansion is only enriching the few, destabilizing the many, enlarges the scale of competition, and pushes the old established institutions beyond their comfortable limits. It shows what happens when a political class stops seeing procedure, stops seeing the normal as a common shelter and rather begins to see it as a terrain to be dominated. It shows what happens when emergency becomes normal, when extraordinary command becomes something that's politically attractive, when legitimacy is hoarded by factions rather than shared in the system itself. It shows how republics can continue speaking in constitutional language, can continue speaking in the language of senators and consuls in the republic long after constitutional character has hollowed out. And maybe the sharpest lesson is this. The Roman Republic did not fail because Romans stopped caring about politics. The Roman Republic failed because they cared so much and in such a zero-sum way that the common framework, it could no longer contain their struggle. There is always a risk in highly energized political societies. Passivism and being passive is not the only danger. Hyper-politicalization can be just as corrosive when every issue becomes this whole total thing, this whole totality, life or death. Every contest is this whole apocalypse thing. Every compromise is dishonorable and every rival unforgivable. Like that's a bit much. So when we ask whether Rome is like America, the best answer is not, yes or no. The best answer is that the late Republic, it's giving us the dictionary. It's giving us the vocabulary for understanding certain Republican diseases. And those diseases are, the overreach of the elite, mass resentment, institutional distrust, the erosion of norms, political norms, the glamour of decisive men, constitutional forms masking the real and formal power, and the fatal temptation to treat political victory as anything more important than political continuity. Romans at the time of Caesar and Octavian did not think they were sleepwalking into an empire. Most of them thought they were improvising, surviving, correcting, defeating their enemies, preserving dignity, restoring the republic, restoring order, defending liberty. That is how republics come apart. Not through a universal mass agreement that the system should end, but through a cumulative behavior that makes the old system impossible to sustain. And that is why the comparison remains worth making. I don't think, not because, America is fated to become Rome and collapse and all of this because of whatever, and not because of some single figure out there like Caesar, some Caesarian-like figure coming about, but in a suit. The useful point is a lot more narrow and harder to hit. A republic can be rich, powerful, brilliant, militarily dominant, but still fragile politically if its elites no longer practice restraint, if its citizens no longer trust institutions, and if constitutional life, constitutional terms become a mask worn by factions fighting for supremacy. I don't think Rome is a prophecy. I don't look at the history of Rome and say, oh, America's inevitably going to collapse like this, and some Caesar in a suit is going to come and, march on Washington. Rome is a study in how success can deform a republic from within. And that's why America keeps returning to it, not out of a cliche, not because, the analogy is perfect, but Rome, it literally lets us see the moment when competitive politics is no longer being bounded by rivalry, and it starts becoming a struggle over whether the regime can still exist in a recognizable form. That's the real comparison. Not, you're not the names, not the costumes or the slogans or the, aesthetics or whatever. Maybe like a little bit, I don't know. But the pressure on the Republican government when power expands faster than restraint. The pressure when political norms and political procedures lose moral authority. The pressure when ambitious men discover that the taboos of old and the norms of old were only taboos because previous generations chose not to test them. Once enough people do test them, the Republic is still there in name, but it is no longer the same thing.